The night of October 11th, 1942. The world holds its breath over a sliver of volcanic rock in the South Pacific called Guadalcanal. Here, in the waters north of the island, the darkness is absolute. The moon has set, leaving the sea and sky to merge into an indistinguishable, suffocating black velvet. This is Iron Bottom Sound, a place already becoming a graveyard for the most powerful warships ever built. Aboard the flagship USS San Francisco, Rear Admiral Norman Scott strains his eyes, peering into the oppressive gloom. For hours, his Task Force 64 has been a phantom, hunting other phantoms. Intelligence reports a Japanese force is coming. Another run of the Tokyo Express, the nightly procession of ships that supplies and reinforces the Imperial Army on the island, tormenting the besieged U.S. Marines. Scott is a man haunted by a ghost. Just 2 months earlier, in this very same stretch of water, the Allied Navy suffered one of the most humiliating defeats in their history at the Battle of Savo Island. 4 heavy cruisers sunk in 32 minutes, over 1,000 sailors lost, while the Japanese vanished back into the darkness without a scratch. The defeat bred a myth that the Imperial Japanese Navy was invincible in the dark. They were the masters of the night, spectral sea lords who struck with supernatural precision. Scott is here to exorcise that ghost. He has drilled his crews relentlessly for this moment, pushing them to the edge, determined that history will not repeat itself. Then, at 11:25 p.m., a crackle over the talk-between-ships radio, the TBS. It's the cruiser USS Helena. "Contact!" The voice is calm, professional, but electric. The ship's new SG radar, a piece of technology so advanced it feels like magic, has pierced the darkness. A contact, bearing 315 degrees, 27,000 yards away. A wave of relief, of validation, washes over the American bridges. The hunt is on. But on Scott's own flagship, the San Francisco, equipped with an older, less reliable radar set, the screen remains blank. The Admiral sees nothing. He hears a ghost report. Moments later, another ship, the USS Boise, also equipped with the superior SG radar, reports 5 targets. But the report is confusing. The bearing is different. The terminology is wrong. The operator calls the ships bogies, a term for aircraft. Is it true bearing or relative? The distinction is critical. One points to the enemy, the other could point anywhere. On the bridge of the San Francisco, doubt begins to creep in. A cold poison in the tropical air. The specter of another disaster looms. Scott's own lead destroyers had become separated from the column during a complex maneuver in the dark. Could his own ships be the ghosts on the radar screens? Fear of friendly fire is a commander's ultimate nightmare. He radios his lead destroyer, the USS Fahrenholt. "Are you coming up on my starboard quarter?" The reply is affirmative. The confusion deepens. At 11:46 p.m., the tension breaks. The Helena, her radar locked, her lookouts now confirming visual contact at a mere 5,000 yards, sends a cryptic message to Scott. "Interrogatory Roger." It's naval jargon, a question and an answer in one, meaning, "Are you ready?" But it's also a plea. Let us open fire. Scott, still wrestling with the conflicting data with the phantom shapes in his mind's eye, replies simply, "Roger." A confirmation of receipt. Nothing more. But for Captain Gilbert Hoover on the Helena, it is enough. It is the permission he so desperately needs. And then the world explodes. Helena's 15 6-inch guns erupt in a single deafening, blinding salvo. The night is torn apart by streaks of orange fire. A moment later, the entire American column following Helena's lead opens up. A wall of steel and high explosives hurtles across the water. On the bridge of the San Francisco, the concussion from his own ship's guns is so violent it steals the breath from Norman Scott's lungs. He is utterly shocked. He never gave the order. He still isn't sure who they are firing at. In that blinding, deafening moment of chaos, the American admiral is gripped by a terrifying thought. Is he presiding over a massacre of his own fleet? This is the story of the Battle of Cape Esperance. It is a battle that has been remembered as a straightforward American victory, a turning point that restored the Navy's honor. But the truth is far more complex, far more chaotic, and far more telling. This was not a battle won by brilliant strategy or flawless execution. Instead, it was a victory born of confusion, shaped by luck, and decided by a technology that its own commander could not bring himself to trust. Our thesis is this: the Battle of Cape Esperance was the critical psychological fracture that shattered the myth of Japanese naval supremacy at night. It was the first stumbling step the U.S. Navy took out of the dark ages of surface warfare and into the new era of technological combat. It was a messy, accidental triumph that proved a crucial point: that even a flawed plan, executed with overwhelming surprise, could topple a seemingly invincible foe. This battle was the first domino, and as it fell, it triggered a chain reaction that would not only determine the fate of Guadalcanal, but would ultimately reshape the entire naval war in the Pacific. It was the night the ghost of Savo Island was finally confronted, not by courage alone, but by invisible waves of radio energy and a sheer, bloody-minded determination to survive. To understand the raw, primal fear that gripped Admiral Scott on his bridge, we must rewind. We must go back to the beginning of the Guadalcanal campaign, to the hot, humid nights of August 1942 when U.S. Marines had stormed the beaches of the island and seized a half-finished Japanese airfield. They had kicked a hornet's nest. The Empire of Japan, still riding high on 6 months of unbroken victories across the Pacific, was not about to let this strategic prize go. The response was swift and savage, and it came at night. This is where the myth was born. The myth of the Imperial Japanese Navy as the undisputed masters of nocturnal combat. It wasn't just propaganda, it was a reputation earned in blood. While other navies saw night fighting as a gamble, a chaotic affair to be avoided, the Japanese had embraced it. They had perfected it into a deadly art form. Their sailors trained for it relentlessly, spending countless hours peering through enormous high-powered binoculars until they could distinguish the silhouette of an enemy ship in the faintest starlight. Their doctrine was built around a single, devastating concept: the decisive battle fought at close range in the dark. And they had a secret weapon that made this doctrine terrifyingly effective: the Type 93 torpedo, known to the Allies as the Long Lance. It was a technological marvel, the finest naval weapon of its era. It was 24 inches in diameter, powered by pure compressed oxygen, which meant it left almost no wake, making it nearly impossible to spot approaching in the dark. It carried a massive warhead of over 1,000 pounds, far larger than its American counterpart. And its range was breathtaking, up to 25 miles, 3 times that of Allied torpedoes. The Long Lance was the silent, invisible killer that prowled the waters of the Solomons. On the night of August 9, 1942, this myth became a horrifying reality. An Allied naval force of 5 heavy cruisers and their destroyer screen was guarding the approaches to Guadalcanal. They were confident, perhaps even arrogant. A Japanese force under Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa steamed down the channel that would soon be known as the Slot. They achieved total, absolute surprise. In a brutal, one-sided engagement that lasted just 32 minutes, Mikawa's cruisers and destroyers, using their superior optics and devastating Long Lance torpedoes, sank 4 Allied heavy cruisers. The American ships USS Quincy, Vincennes, and Astoria, and the Australian HMAS Canberra. Over 1,000 Allied sailors went to their graves. The Japanese fleet turned for home without suffering a single hit on any of its major ships. The Battle of Savo Island, as it came to be known, was more than a defeat. It was a psychological trauma. It sent a shockwave of disbelief and humiliation through the Allied command. How could this have happened? The Americans and Australians had radar, a technology the Japanese lacked. Yet it had done them no good. They were outthought, outfought, and outmaneuvered. The battle cemented the legend of Japanese invincibility. From that night on, the waters around Guadalcanal became their personal hunting ground after sunset. Samuel Eliot Morison, the great naval historian, wrote of the aftermath, "From sunrise to sunset, the Americans controlled the seas. But as night fell over Iron Bottom Sound, their ships scattered like frightened children from a graveyard." And this was the world that Rear Admiral Norman Scott inherited. A 53-year-old veteran, he was a thoughtful, meticulous officer who had seen service in the First World War. He knew that the fight for Guadalcanal would be won or lost at sea, and that the sea battles would be decided at night. The problem was not just Japanese skill, it was American unpreparedness. The U.S. Navy of 1942 was a daytime Navy. Its doctrine focused on long-range gunnery duels fought in clear weather. Night combat was a disorganized afterthought. Scott was determined to change that. For 3 weeks leading up to Cape Esperance, he transformed his Task Force 64 into a floating laboratory for night fighting. He drilled his crews without mercy. From dusk until dawn, every night his ships were at battle stations. They practiced maneuvers in blacked-out conditions. They rehearsed communications protocols, and they drilled their gun crews until their hands were raw. Scott was forging a new weapon, trying to instill in his men a confidence that had been shattered at Savo Island. He was a man with a singular obsession: to prove that Americans could fight in the dark. Meanwhile, the Japanese continued to operate with impunity. Their Tokyo Express ran like clockwork. Fast destroyers and light cruisers would dash down the slot from their base in the Shortland Islands, drop off troops and supplies, sometimes shell the American perimeter around Henderson Field, and be gone by dawn. In early October, they planned a major operation. One group, a reinforcement convoy under Rear Admiral Takatsugu Jojima, would land heavy artillery and more than 700 soldiers to support a new ground offensive. A second, more powerful group, a bombardment force of 3 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers under Rear Admiral Eritomo Goto, would precede them, tasked with pulverizing Henderson Field to suppress the American aircraft that posed a threat to Jojima's transports. Admiral Goto was the embodiment of the Japanese naval myth. He was a confident, experienced commander, a veteran of the victories that had swept the Japanese Empire across the Pacific. He had no reason to expect any serious opposition. The Americans, in his mind and in the collective mind of the Imperial Japanese Navy, did not fight at night. They had learned their lesson at Savo Island. His approach to Guadalcanal was swift and direct. His powerful cruisers, Aoba, Furutaka, and Kinugasa, raced south at 30 knots. He relied on his superb lookouts, the keenest eyes in any navy in the world. He had no radar, but he felt he didn't need it. The night, after all, belonged to him. And so the stage was set. 2 forces, moving through the same patch of black water, on a collision course with history. One was led by a man haunted by the past, desperately trying to prepare his men for a fight he knew was coming. The other was led by a man supremely confident in his own superiority, blinded by the myth of his own invincibility. The antagonist in this drama was not a person or a nation. It was the crushing, absolute darkness of a moonless Pacific night, a void where assumptions were lethal, and where a single, unseen spark of technology was about to change everything. On the evening of October 11th, Admiral Scott's Task Force 64 steamed into the channel between Guadalcanal and Savo Island, a watery coliseum of impending combat. His plan was straightforward, a classic naval maneuver. He would patrol the likely approach route of the Tokyo Express, get between the Japanese and the island, and use his cruiser's firepower to annihilate them. He arranged his ships in a single column, a long line of steel stretching over 3 miles. At the head were 3 destroyers, the van. In the center, the powerful core of his force, 4 cruisers, San Francisco, Boise, Salt Lake City, and Helena. Bringing up the rear were 2 more destroyers. It was a textbook formation, designed for concentrated firepower. But in the disorienting darkness, a textbook formation can quickly become a deadly trap. At 11:32 p.m., Scott gave the order for the entire column to execute a 180-degree turn. The maneuver was intended to reverse his course and place him squarely in the path of the incoming Japanese. In broad daylight, it would have been routine. In the pitch black, it was chaos. The 3 van destroyers, Fahrenholt, Duncan, and Laffey, misinterpreted the command or struggled to execute it in the poor visibility. Instead of turning in sequence with the heavy cruisers, they broke formation. 2 of them ended up steaming parallel to the main column, but out of position. The third, the USS Duncan, under Lieutenant Commander Edmund Taylor, became completely separated, a lone wolf charging ahead into the darkness. This single, flawed maneuver was the first domino to fall. It sowed the seed of the confusion that would plague Scott for the rest of the night. His perfectly ordered battle line was now a ragged, uncertain formation, with friendly ships in unexpected places. It was into this state of disarray that the future arrived. At 11:25 p.m., the cathode ray tube screen in the radar plot of the USS Helena glowed with life. A series of small, faint blips appeared on the screen's edge. This was the work of the SG radar, a quantum leap in naval technology. Unlike the older SC sets, which were essentially glorified rangefinders, the SG provided a plan position indicator, or PPI scope. For the first time, a radar operator could see a true, map-like picture of the surrounding sea, with his own ship at the center and other vessels appearing as distinct points of light. It was like having the eyes of God. Helena's radar officer could see the Japanese column still miles away as clearly as if it were a model on a tabletop. He had pierced the veil of night that had protected the Japanese for so long. The report crackled over the radio to the flagship, San Francisco. But Admiral Scott's world remained dark. His older SC radar showed nothing. Then came the report from Boise, whose SG set also picked up the enemy. But the report was garbled, confusing. Scott was now in a commander's hell. His most advanced sensors were telling him the enemy was there, but his own eyes, and his own ship's equipment, told him nothing. Worse, the specter of his own wayward destroyers haunted him. Were those blips on Helena's screen the Japanese? Or were they the Duncan, the Fahrenholt, and the Laffey, wandering blindly where they shouldn't be? To open fire on the wrong target would be an unforgivable catastrophe. The ghost of Savo Island whispered of Japanese superiority, but the immediate fear was of fratricide. Meanwhile, miles away, Admiral Goto's column steamed confidently onward. He was completely unaware that his force was being tracked by invisible electronic beams. His trust was placed entirely in the human eye. Around 11:43 p.m., a lookout aboard his flagship, the heavy cruiser Aoba, called out. Silhouettes spotted ahead. 3 ships. Goto was unfazed. His mind, conditioned by months of unchallenged dominance, processed this information through a filter of supreme confidence. The Americans did not operate here at night. Therefore, these ships could not be American. They must be part of Admiral Jojima's reinforcement group, which he knew was in the area. It was a logical conclusion based on a fatally flawed premise. This is a classic example of confirmation bias, a psychological trap that has doomed commanders throughout history. Goto saw what he expected to see, not what was actually there. He ordered the Oba to flash the day's recognition signal at the unidentified ships, a series of coded lights. He even ordered his column to reduce speed. He was making a friendly approach. On the American bridges, the strange flashing lights from the dark shapes only deepened the confusion. Were these their own destroyers trying to identify themselves? Aboard the Aoba, even as the range closed to a terrifyingly close 7,500 yards, and as lookouts began to insist the silhouettes were enemy warships, Goto remained unconvinced. He ordered the recognition signal flashed again. He was a man trapped by his own myth. The idea that an American force would be here, in his waters, at his time, formed into a perfect battle line and waiting for him, was simply inconceivable. It did not compute with the established order of the world. This was the turning point. A clash not of ships, but of philosophies. On one side, an American admiral paralyzed by uncertainty, distrustful of a new technology he didn't fully understand. On the other, a Japanese admiral, paralyzed by certainty, blinded by a belief in his own invincibility. The fate of hundreds of men hung in the balance of this psychological stalemate. The stalemate was broken by Captain Gilbert Hoover of the USS Helena. His radar plot was clear. His lookouts were positive. The enemy was right there, a perfect target. He could wait no longer. He sent his famous laconic message, "Interrogatory Roger," and it was a stroke of genius, a phrase that could be interpreted in multiple ways, giving him plausible deniability if he was wrong, but conveying his urgent intent. When Scott replied with a simple Roger, confirming he had received the message, Hoover took it as the clearance he needed. He gave the order that would echo across the Pacific. At 11:46 p.m., the Helena's main battery opened fire. The first salvo was like the striking of a match in a gas-filled room. The night didn't just light up, it detonated. The rest of the American line, seeing Helena's muzzle flashes, joined in a cascading torrent of fire. An avalanche of steel descended upon the unsuspecting Japanese column. The myth of Japanese nocturnal invincibility was about to be shattered, not by a subtle stratagem or a daring maneuver, but by a blinding, brutal, overwhelming deluge of high-explosive shells. Unleashed in a moment of profound confusion, the turning point had arrived as a deafening, fiery shockwave. The eruption of gunfire from the American line achieved something that Admiral Scott, in his state of confusion, could never have planned. A perfect execution of the classic naval maneuver known as crossing the T. His column, by sheer luck of positioning, was steaming at a right angle across the path of Goto's column. This gave every American cruiser the ability to fire a full broadside, using all of their main guns. The Japanese, in contrast, were caught in line, able to bring only their forward-facing turrets to bear. It was the most advantageous tactical position in surface warfare, and the Americans had stumbled into it completely by accident. The first victim of this accidental brilliance was Admiral Goto himself. His flagship, the Aoba, was still flashing its recognition signals when the first shells from Helena and Boise slammed into its superstructure. Within seconds, it was struck by an estimated 40 shells. The 6-inch rounds from the light cruisers shredded the upper works, while the heavier 8-inch shells from San Francisco and Salt Lake City punched through armor. Communications were severed. 2 of the main gun turrets were knocked out. 1 shell hit the flag bridge. It failed to detonate, but the kinetic energy alone was enough to kill several staff officers and mortally wound Admiral Goto. His last words were reported to be a bewildered question. "What is this? Are they friendly ships?" He died a victim of his own fatal assumption. Command of the shattered Japanese force fell to Captain Kijimi, but with the Aoba's communication systems destroyed, he was a commander with no voice. Behind the burning Aoba, the heavy cruiser Furutaka faced a captain's worst choice. Her commander, Captain Araki Tsutao, instantly realized they had sailed into an ambush. His instinct was to turn away from the torrent of fire. But naval doctrine dictated that he follow the movements of the flagship. When the crippled Aoba made a turn to starboard, deeper into the American kill zone, Araki dutifully followed. It was a fatal mistake. As the Aoba laid a smokescreen and slipped into the darkness, the Furutaka became the sole, beautifully illuminated target for the entire American fleet. The light cruisers Helena and Boise, each armed with 15 rapid-firing 6-inch guns, poured a relentless stream of shells onto the hapless cruiser. A shell struck near her torpedo tubes, which were loaded with the volatile long-lance torpedoes. The resulting explosion started a massive fire, turning the Furutica into a glowing beacon for the American gunners. She absorbed dozens of hits, many below the waterline, but her crew's heroic damage control kept her afloat and fighting for hours before she finally succumbed to the waves in the early morning. The twist in this story of American triumph is just how close it came to unraveling. A mere 1 minute after the firing started, Admiral Scott, still convinced his ships were firing on his own destroyers, broadcast a frantic order, "Cease firing!" Some ships complied. Others, caught in the ferocious adrenaline of battle, either didn't hear the command or chose to ignore it. For 4 critical minutes, the American barrage slackened. It was a moment of hesitation that could have cost them the battle. Still uncertain, Scott ordered all his destroyers to flash their recognition lights. When he saw the friendly lights blinking in the proper position separate from the burning targets, the reality finally sank in. At 11:51 p.m., he gave the order to resume fire. The brief lull had given the shocked Japanese time to react, but their response was scattered and ineffective. The damage was already done. Now, the American gunners turned their attention to a new target. The destroyer Fubuki, which had been screening the Aoba, found herself trapped. The USS San Francisco illuminated her with a searchlight, pinning her in a brilliant white glare. It was a death sentence. Every ship in the American line that could bear its guns trained them on the Fubuki. She was hit again and again, torn apart by shells of every caliber, until she exploded and sank, the first ship to go down that night. But the battle was far from one-sided. The chaos of the initial American maneuver now came back to haunt them. The destroyer USS Duncan, which had charged ahead alone, found herself between the two fleets. She fired her guns and torpedoes at the Furutica before being struck by a hail of shells from both sides. Friendly fire and enemy fire mingled in a deadly storm. Her forward funnel was blown off, fires broke out in her ammunition magazines, and her rudder was jammed. She began to circle helplessly, a burning wreck. Her sister ship, the USS Fahrenholt, was also caught in the crossfire, likely from American cruisers, taking hits that killed several crewmen, disabled her fire control, and forced her to withdraw from the fight. The Japanese, though surprised and battered, were not toothless. The cruiser Kinugasa, skillfully handled, had avoided the worst of the initial onslaught. She now sought revenge. At 12:06 a.m., she launched a spread of long-lance torpedoes and opened fire on the American column. Her target was the USS Boise. For 3 minutes, the Boise endured a furious barrage. An 8-inch shell from Kinugasa struck her forward turret and penetrated deep into the ship, exploding in a magazine for her 6-inch guns. The blast was catastrophic, killing nearly everyone in the forward part of the ship. A huge orange fireball erupted from the Boise's bow. It seemed she was doomed to explode. But in a bizarre twist of fate, the very shell that caused the explosion had also ripped a massive hole in the ship's hull below the waterline. A torrent of seawater rushed in, flooding the burning magazines and extinguishing the fire that would have certainly destroyed the ship. It was a miracle of destruction, an act of salvation delivered by an enemy shell. The heavily damaged Boise, with over 100 men dead, was forced to sheer out of the battle line, lucky to be alive. The battle devolved into a series of smaller, confused engagements as the Japanese attempted to flee. By midnight, Scott ordered a general ceasefire. The main action was over. The autopsy revealed a stunning, if messy, American victory. The Japanese had lost the heavy cruiser Furutaka and the destroyer Fubuki. The heavy cruiser Aoba was severely damaged. Admiral Goto was dead. The Americans had lost one destroyer, the Duncan, which sank the next day. The cruiser Boise and the destroyer Fahrenholt were badly damaged, and the cruiser Salt Lake City had also taken a hit. The ripple effect was immediate. On the crippled Aoba, Captain Kijimi, in a well-intentioned lie, reassured the dying Admiral Goto that 2 American cruisers had been sunk. At the Japanese headquarters in Rabaul, the initial reports were of a great victory. But as the hours ticked by and the Furutaka and Fubuki failed to report in, the truth began to emerge. Disbelief turned to shock. The Americans had stood and fought at night and won. But the ripples continued. While Goto's bombardment force was being savaged, Admiral Joyama's reinforcement group, the original objective of the Tokyo Express, had slipped past the battle undetected. They successfully landed their troops, their supplies, and their heavy artillery on Guadalcanal. And in the morning, when Japanese destroyers were sent back to rescue survivors from the Furutaka, they were spotted by American aircraft from the very airfield Goto had been sent to destroy. In a series of relentless air attacks, 2 more Japanese destroyers, the Murakumo and Natsugumo, were sent to the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound. The cost for Japan was mounting, a cascade of losses triggered by Goto's single moment of fatal overconfidence. The dominoes were falling, faster and faster. When the sun rose on October 12, 1942, the blue waters of Iron Bottom Sound were littered with the debris of a savage night. Oil slicks, wreckage, and desperate men clinging to floating fragments marked the battlefield. On the surface, the outcome of the Battle of Cape Esperance seemed clear. The United States Navy had won a tactical victory. They had lost 1 destroyer and had 2 cruisers and another destroyer damaged. In exchange, they had sunk a Japanese heavy cruiser and a destroyer, and their aircraft had finished off 2 more destroyers the following day. They had killed a Japanese admiral and inflicted hundreds of casualties. The headlines back home were triumphant, proclaiming a great victory that had disrupted a major Japanese reinforcement effort. But the long-term consequences, the true legacy of Cape Esperance, were far more nuanced and profound. The victory was, in a strategic sense, incomplete. Admiral Jojima's transports, the primary reason for the Tokyo Express run, had succeeded in their mission. The 728 soldiers and, most critically, the heavy 150mm howitzers they brought ashore would soon be shelling the American perimeter at Henderson Field, adding to the misery of the beleaguered Marines. The battle had not stopped the Japanese buildup. It had merely bloodied the nose of the Imperial Navy. The fight for Guadalcanal was far from over. In fact, it was about to enter its most brutal phase. The real legacy of Cape Esperance was not measured in sunken tonnage, but in shattered psychology. For the Americans, it was a desperately needed injection of confidence. It was proof that they were not cursed to be victims in the dark. Proof that their technology, particularly the SG radar, gave them a decisive, war-winning advantage if they could learn to trust it. Proof that the Japanese sailor, for all his skill and bravery, was mortal. The ghost of Savo Island had not been banished, but it had been wounded. The fear of the night began to recede, replaced by a cautious, hard-won confidence. For the Japanese, the defeat was a bewildering shock. Their high command in Rabaul initially refused to believe the reports. It was inconceivable, but the empty berths in the Shortland Islands harbor told the truth. The loss forced a painful reassessment. The Americans were not the timid daytime sailors they had been scornfully dismissed as. They were willing to fight at night, and they had tools that allowed them to see in the dark. The myth of their own invincibility, a cornerstone of their naval identity, had cracked. Admiral Ugaki, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, correctly diagnosed the cause not as American brilliance, but as Japanese general negligence, a polite term for the fatal arrogance displayed by Admiral Goto. The defeat was a wake-up call, but it was one they would struggle to adapt to. Their doctrine was rigid, and their industrial base could not compete with America's in producing the kind of advanced electronics that were now changing the face of war. Cape Esperance was, in essence, a bloody dress rehearsal. It was the first act in a 3-part tragedy of naval combat that would define the Guadalcanal campaign. The lessons learned here about the power of radar, the chaos of night combat, the importance of clear communication, and the danger of assumptions would be paid for in blood again just 1 month later. In the savage, sprawling naval Battle of Guadalcanal in mid-November, the two navies would clash again in a series of brutal, point-blank engagements. And in that battle, Admiral Norman Scott, the hero of Cape Esperance, would be killed on the bridge of his new flagship, the USS Atlanta, a victim of the same kind of confused, chaotic night fighting he had survived before. He died a hero who had already delivered his most important contribution to the war. He had shown the way. The universal lesson of Cape Esperance is a timeless one, a story of the perilous clash between tradition and innovation, between established doctrine and disruptive technology. Admiral Goto and the Imperial Japanese Navy were masters of a craft that was becoming obsolete. They had perfected the art of visual, close-range night combat at the precise historical moment that it was being rendered irrelevant by the invisible eye of radar. Their confidence in their past successes blinded them to the realities of the present. They were like master swordsmen who brought their perfectly honed blades to a gunfight. This is a pattern we see repeated throughout human history, in war, in business, and in society. Powerful institutions become so invested in the methods that brought them success that they fail to see the ground shifting beneath their feet. They become prisoners of their own dogma. Think of the French knights at Agincourt, their heavy armor useless against the English longbow. Or in the modern era, consider corporations like Kodak or Blockbuster, giants of their industries who were so confident in their existing business models that they dismissed the disruptive potential of digital photography and streaming media, leading to their own demise. The fog of war is not just about the confusion of the battlefield. It is also about the fog of arrogance, the inability to adapt to a changing world. And so we conclude where we began, in the dark waters of Iron Bottom Sound. Today, it is a place of serene, tropical beauty. But beneath the calm surface lies a museum of sunken history, the steel tombs of the men who fought and died here. The wrecks of the Furitaka and the Duncan, of the Aoba and the Boise's fallen shipmates, are silent monuments to a single, chaotic night. The Battle of Cape Esperance was not the war's most decisive engagement, nor its largest, but it may have been one of its most important. It was the night the future arrived, unannounced in a flash of gunfire. It was the night a myth died, and with it, the certainty of an empire. It was the beginning of the end for the masters of the night, who were ultimately defeated by an enemy they could not see, guided by a power they did not understand.